Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Much of Wyoming's energy development occurs on federal lands and with federal minerals, and that'll be the topic of today's podcast. Much of Wyoming, in particular, about 2/3 of our minerals are federal minerals. So this is really important to the state, and that doesn't include things like wind development on federal land, which also is really important for energy in Wyoming. So today's episode features a University of Wyoming expert on federal permitting, Dr. Temple Stoellinger. She's Associate Dean and a Wyoming Excellence Chair at the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources, Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the College of Law, Gina Guy Center for Land and Water Law, and a School of Energy Resources adjunct faculty member. So, Dr. Stoellinger, welcome. How do you do all those things?
Thank you. I sleep a little less than I used to.
Sure. So let's start by having you tell our listeners about your background and how you came to work at your dual role at the University of Wyoming Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources, and then the College of Law. Not to mention, like I said, that you also are very engaged with us here at the School of Energy Resources.
Well, great. Well, I'm actually a very proud University of Wyoming undergraduate alumni myself. I graduated from the University of Wyoming in 2024 with a dual degree in Environment, Natural Resources, and Communications. I was actually on my way to law school that summer. I was working for the Forest Service as a timber crew member when Governor Freudenthal asked me if I would consider joining his policy team. I think I had to Google who the governor of Wyoming was at that point. And do a lot of quick research at the library before my interview. So I'm shocked they hired me, but I had an amazing chance to go work for his administration at the ripe age of 21 and just had a chance to really learn from some of the best natural resource attorneys, I think, in the country. And through my growth in that role, had a chance to work on some of the state's major federal land projects, including quite a few BLM and Forest Service land management plans, some major energy projects, including the Pinedale Anticline EIS and the Chokecherry Sierra Madre Wind Energy EIS, its early stages anyway. And then also other issues like Forest Service roadless rules and snowmobiling in Yellowstone. And my experience of working with those exceptional attorneys really affirmed my desire to attend law school. So I ended up deciding to go to the University of Wyoming Law School so I could keep working for the governor. And then after the conclusion of Governor Freudenthal's second term, had a chance to go work for Shell at their international headquarters in the Netherlands. I worked for their projects and technology division, but I really missed Wyoming. They say that, Wyoming has a boomerang effect. You may leave, but you'll probably come back. And that was true for me. So I came back and initially took a position with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association as their natural resources staff attorney, and then started working for the University of Wyoming actually in about 2013 and have been here ever since.
Great. So federal rules and land use plans and environmental impact statements for energy projects, they all go through what's called the National Environmental Policy Act, otherwise known as NEPA. And as someone who has extensive expertise and has written several papers on NEPA, can you tell our listeners what is NEPA? What is the NEPA process?
You bet. I actually teach a 2-credit class on NEPA. So if anybody really wants to geek out on NEPA, you could join us. It'll be online, so you could take it no matter where you're at in the state. So just some background information. So NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, was passed by Congress in 1969. It was actually signed on January 1st, 1970 by President Nixon. And it's an environmental law that applies to a wide range of federal activities, including land use planning, like the Rock Springs RMP, which I know we're going to talk about soon, rulemaking, and any project really with a federal nexus, including energy projects, wind energy projects, oil and gas projects. Really at its core, NEPA requires agencies to take a hard look at potential environmental effects before moving forward with a project. And this typically requires preparing either an environmental assessment, what we call an EA, or a more detailed environmental impact statement, or an EIS. And basically, these documents evaluate factors such as impacts on air, water quality, wildlife, cultural resources. And they also emphasize public participation and transparency. So there's an opportunity for communities and stakeholders and experts to weigh in on proposed projects. And really the heart of any NEPA document is what we call the reasonable range of alternatives. So it's a variety of options the federal government could take with regards to its decision, and then what are the environmental consequences under each of those alternatives. So it's really a transparency, look or measure twice, cut once kind of a rule. And I think it's important to note, too, that NEPA has kind of long been interpreted as a procedural law, so it doesn't mandate a specific environmental outcome, but instead it focuses on transparency and a full understanding of environmental consequences. And so in that sense, it's really played kind of a critical role in balancing development with environmental protection and sort of looking before you leap.
You know, it's interesting. You're using this term federal nexus, and we know federal minerals, federal land, those obviously you're going to go through NEPA, the NEPA process. But also if you have federal funding, you might have to go through it as well, depending on what you're undertaking. And so I think it's really important, even though for engineers and technology types that we love to talk technology, but really none of that matters if you can't get it permitted. And I think the other thing, this is the process that the federal side has put in place for projects. But of course, there are other approaches, like just because it's not on federal lands or doesn't have a federal nexus, there's still a lot of permitting involved in different energy projects. So we're just focusing on that federal side today, which is so important for Wyoming. So building on your explanation, what's the importance of the NEPA process in Wyoming? And the federal government owns almost half the surface and 2/3 of the minerals. So how important is this process for us here in terms of energy development?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Because of Wyoming's really significant federal resources, NEPA plays a really big role in the state of Wyoming. And I think that's true for energy development, but NEPA also touches things like grazing permits and recreation and even conservation activities. Given that federal land impact in the state of Wyoming, NEPA plays a crucial role in ensuring these decisions are made with transparency and public input. NEPA also provides a structured process for assessing environmental impacts before projects move forward, whether it's approving an oil and gas lease or siting a wind farm, or even updating a land management plan. And Wyoming's economy is really deeply tied to natural resource development, but it's also identifies as a place with vast open spaces and crucial wildlife habitat and world-renowned outdoor recreation. And so NEPA helps us balance those interests by requiring agencies to consider alternatives, evaluate impacts, and allow stakeholders, including ranchers, conservationists, energy representatives, and tribal nations, to have a voice in the decision-making process. But I do want to say, NEPA has certainly been criticized for causing delays in projects. Some energy infrastructure developments have been held up for years due to lengthy environmental reviews and subsequent litigation. So I think it's really important to kind of strike an appropriate balance between environmental reviews and efficient decision making.
So you might have alluded to this, but some folks have said that throughout the years, the NEPA process has expanded beyond its original intent. Would you agree with that statement?
I do agree with that statement. And actually, if you look at the first CEQ regulations that were published, they contemplated a pretty efficient NEPA process. Maybe 150 pages, maybe 300 pages. And so we've gotten to the point in recent years where we see NEPA documents stretching into thousands of pages. And I think at that point, they really lose their public relevance. They're no longer serving one of their core purposes of providing transparency and meaningful public engagement. You have to be an expert, essentially, to read a NEPA document at that level.
Exactly. How are you transparent if you have a multi-1,000-page document that no layperson can understand? Yeah,
completely agree. And, the sheer volume of information makes it's very difficult to weigh through. Even decision makers, I would really say at that point. But there have been some recent amendments to actually the structure of NEPA itself, the statute itself. So the Fiscal Responsibility Act, I think, helped realign NEPA back with its original intent. So under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, an environmental impact statement has to be completed within 2 years, and it has to be under 300 pages. And an environmental assessment has to take a year and be under 150 pages. So I think this helps kind of promote efficiency while hopefully still maintaining the integrity of the environmental review process. And ultimately, hopefully a more concise, focused analysis makes it easier for stakeholders to engage with the process and for agencies to make informed and timely decisions. We're just starting to see some projects developed under this new framework of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, so it's a little bit too soon to say how impactful these changes are going to be in practice. But layered on top of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we've seen, new CEQ regulations proposed by the Biden administration, and then, recent developments in the Trump administration to actually remand all CEQ regulations. So we're in a bit of a period of uncertainty with, federal agencies and companies and really all stakeholders trying to figure exactly, what's the path forward for NEPA compliance in the future.
So NEPA has a large role in the federal permitting process for large energy projects, including transmission, which if you are following energy news, we have to grow power output in the U.S. So transmission is going to be important as part of that. And it can take several years to get federal approval for energy projects. So this has led to significant interest in enacting federal permitting reform. What can be done to reduce the time of the permitting process for faster federal approval of energy projects in Wyoming?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Transmission line projects in particular are a tough nut to crack because of the interstate nature of the projects.
Yep.
And some counties even require county approval. So not only are you waiting and working on state approval, but probably local government approval as well. So that makes transmission projects a particular challenge. I do think, as I was talking about, those amendments under the Fiscal Responsibility Act are going to be pretty helpful to expediting projects. We just need to give them some time and space to kind of work. I think another thing to point out, too, is the ability to use programmatic documents to help expedite some energy projects. One thing I did want to point out under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, so if it's an EIS, it's 2 years and 300 pages. If it's an EA, it's 1 year, 150 pages. But there is an exception that allows for more time and more pages for particularly complex projects. And I do suspect that a lot of major energy projects will probably qualify for that exception. And so I don't think we're going to stick on those tight FRA timelines for energy projects. So that being said, I think there's still a need for some better interagency coordination, some upfront planning, utilization of programmatic NEPA documents where maybe you're doing a west-wide transmission EIS, and then when you have a local Wyoming project, you can tier from that bigger national project, which may address some of the more regional issues and make the individual state project a little bit more efficient.
Okay, so programmatic project, or what did you say?
Programmatic NEPA document.
Okay. So that means you're looking at more than just one project at a time?
Exactly. Maybe you're looking at the development of wind energy across the West, across multiple Western states, or solar energy across multiple Western states. And so you can address some of the big issues like Endangered Species Act compliance at kind of a broad scale Western level. And then when you go down to a site-specific project in Wyoming, you can tier to that programmatic document, meaning you don't have to redo all of that analysis. So that can make your local project a more efficient process.
Got it. So talk about if, let's say that these efficiency improvements are made or they seem to be working, how do we know that there's not like corners being cut in terms of environmental impact?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and probably important to point out that it's not just NEPA that we have to consider complying with. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act are all still stopgaps for environmental concern. And I would say I don't think we're going to see an end to NEPA litigation as a result of the amendments under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And so I think that will continue to be sort of a check to make sure we still have safeguards for environmental protection as well.
So you already alluded to this. There was a recent D.C. Circuit Court ruling that the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which is otherwise known as CEQ, it does not have the authority to issue regulations implementing NEPA, and that CEQ's NEPA regulations are invalid. So let's start. That was a big ruling. What are your thoughts?
That was a big ruling, and it happened right when I was teaching NEPA last semester.
Oh, so how exciting!
Made NEPA even more exciting. Yeah.
So no one ever I'm just kidding.
No, that's that was a really interesting case, and it was in front of the 3-judge panel of the DC Circuit, and it was actually an unbriefed issue, so something the judges addressed on their own without the benefit of it being briefed by the litigants in that case. And you're right, 2 judges said that what they wanted to address was the fact that they felt like CEQ's regulations were invalid because they were directed under the authority of an executive order rather than a statutory direction to issue those regulations. So a shockwave when it was issued, but the actual impact of that case wasn't particularly too broad because it was just the DC Circuit, so it wasn't binding on any other circuits. And ultimately, the case went in front of the full panel of the DC circuits, and they said that, that issue wasn't fully briefed, and it also wasn't directly relevant to the outcome of the case, which was found on the actual text of NEPA itself and not the CEQ regulations. But, a couple things have happened since that decision, which kind of make the ruling irrelevant, actually. And that's the issuing of President Trump's executive order repealing the 1977 President Carter EO that directed CEQ to issue its regulations, and now decisions by the CEQ to repeal its current NEPA regulations and to say it wasn't going to pass any new regulations moving forward and instead would issue guidance to the agencies instead of regulations. So that case was exciting, but probably at this point not super relevant because of more recent actions.
But I bet it was kind of a great exposure for your students that were in the class at the time.
Definitely. And we had a couple of legal experts come talk to us about the case in real time, which was pretty fun.
That is awesome. So how will the court's ruling work with President Trump's executive order, which is called Unleashing American Energy, that directs CEQ to propose a repeal of its existing NEPA regulations and revise guidance to its agencies on implementing NEPA? And that was a mouthful. So yeah, how is all this going to work?
Well, yeah, and it's happening. So CEQ has now said that they have repealed their regulations and are instead moving to guiding agencies through a guidance document instead of binding regulations. So what will continue to happen is, NEPA as a statute exists as amended by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and agencies have their own individual NEPA regulations and will still have to continue to comply with NEPA as a statute. But when they do so, they'll lean on their own internal NEPA regulations as that binding authority instead of the CEQ regulations. But at the same time, CEQ has directed agencies within a year to revise their NEPA regulations to be consistent with what essentially was President Trump's NEPA regulations from 2020. And so it'll be an exciting year to see how the agencies work to revise their internal NEPA regulations. It's an exciting year, but it's also a bit of a year of uncertainty because we have continuing projects that need to move forward. So I know everybody's kind of eager to see what the outcome of all of this is going to be.
Yeah, we're rebuilding the plane while flying.
Exactly.
Which is what I feel like we do a lot around here in the School of Energy Resources with our partners across the university. We're always building and flying at the same time. So, okay, so let's move on to something that has gotten a ton of attention in Wyoming, the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan. A significant portion of the people in the state were concerned. We saw a lot of concern across the state, truly, with the draft Rock Springs, what's called the RMP, Resource Management Plan, that the Bureau of Land Management released last year. So much so that Governor Gordon assembled a task force consisting of various stakeholders to develop recommendations for revising that proposed or the draft RMP. You played a really important role in that task force. I think one thing we talk about regularly on this podcast is how Wyoming can have not just task forces, but it's a great example of collaborative groups working together to achieve common outcomes. So talk about, in your experience, the value of that particular collaborative task force and your role in that process.
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard these task force processes actually maybe referred to as the Wyoming way of getting a diverse group of stakeholders together to engage in a dialogue about a path forward that sort of meets maybe not everybody's objectives, but, finding some common ground on a strategy to move forward that sort of makes sense for the majority. So that was the process that we utilized in the task force that the governor asked the Ruckelshaus Institute to lead in collaboration with the School of Energy Resources and the College of Ag as well. And so, yeah, I think that process was exactly that, getting, a diverse group of stakeholders, key Wyoming stakeholders together to talk about the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan and how we could come up with a Wyoming solution. between draft and final for that particular document.
So talk about the process that took place.
Well, great. So the draft RMP was issued in August of 2024. As you noted, it was, of concern to many people in Wyoming. As written, to my knowledge, it was the first time we'd seen the Bureau of Land Management in a resource management plan select the environmentally preferred alternative. And so, rightful concerns about the impact on the field office and the local economies and really the state economy as a result of really restricting future energy development and other concerns as well. And so Governor Gordon was able to work with the BLM to extend the public comment period until January to give folks in Wyoming some more time to digest this 1,300-page document, and also for a task force to be formed to kind of dig in the document and develop that Wyoming solution. And so, as I mentioned, yes, the University of Wyoming to step in. And so we hosted a round of public meetings to start that process, to get the public's input to the task force about how they wanted to see the RMP amended. After we facilitated those meetings, then we moved forward with the task force project and held a series of meetings in Rock Springs and a couple virtually, I should know, all over Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year. So many thanks to all the participants of the task force who did a lot of hard work over the holidays last year.
But you had a foot surgery during that.
I had an ankle surgery during
Oh my gosh.
Not the best timed surgery. No.
Oh, thank you for your service. Okay, keep going. Want to acknowledge that though.
Yeah, you bet. So we worked very hard. The task force members worked really hard, dug into that 1,300-page document, and we had discussions on nearly every management action in that RMP to try and find a collaborative agreement or, some consensus around recommendations on how individual text in the RMP could be improved. And so ultimately, I think we had pretty good success. We had, a limited time period. The task force really had about 60 days in total to do its work. Normally, these types of collaborative processes ideally should take 6 months to a year. So you have time to really build cohesion amongst the group and have time to really review the policy that you're analyzing. So it was pretty tight time period, but even with that constraint, we came up with over 100 recommendations, again, helping to kind of develop that Wyoming solution for the Rock Springs RMP to move forward.
Wow. So what was the end result?
Well, I think we had some influence. I haven't done this analysis myself, but I have heard that over 80 to almost 90% of the task force recommendations were accepted by the Rock Springs field office as they issued their final RMP. Obviously, there was still work to be done, and I know the governor's office worked really hard through their consistency review process to get some additional changes. Ultimately, the BLM released its final decision in December. I think while we made some progress on the RMP, there was probably still a lot of concern with the document from Wyoming's perspective. So I think the task force helped. It helped move it along. Again, it was a time-limited process, and obviously we can only make recommendations to the BLM. We can't force them to take the suggestions verbatim.
So there's no question the task force moved the needle. And most of the recommendations were taken in and considered and ultimately used by BLM. But there's still some issues. Not everyone's satisfied with the final Rock Springs RMP. So there's been discussions of possible ways to still change it, either through the Congressional Review Act or RMP amendments. Can you talk about like the different options and if you think either one of those would be a better solution?
Yeah, definitely. So my understanding is, right now the Secretary of the Department of the Interior has actually paused the implementation of the new resource management plan and has asked that for it to be opened up and amended, which I think is the correct approach. I worried pretty significantly that the Congressional Review Act was going to be used to strike the Rock Springs resource management plan. And the reason I was concerned about that is the Congressional Review Act says when you strike a particular policy, it says you can never put anything like it in its place. And so I think people were reasonably concerned with some remaining components of the final resource management plan. There were still some positive parts of the RMP and things that were just common sense. And so if you use the Congressional Review Act and then you can never put anything like it in its place, are you really narrowing the opportunity for, federal land use planning in the future?
Yeah, you can't use the good parts.
You can't use the good parts, yeah. So it's a very blunt tool, the Congressional Review Act. You throw out the good and the bad, and then you can never put anything like it in its place. So I was just really worried about the Congressional Review Act, but am pleased to hear that the process moving forward is really through the amendment process instead.
I have to say, it's incredible how you keep all these rules straight in your head. You know, us engineers and scientists, we like math and we like things that you don't actually have to remember. You just figure it out. So it's truly incredible. And it just shows you the complexity of all this. And I think we're so lucky to have you here at the University of Wyoming. Our students get to learn from someone like you. So thank you for all you do. So
thanks. Well, it's really only NEPA and ESA. Don't ask me questions about anything else.
Okay. I won't, but it's impressive. So for our last question, we always like to highlight the incredible state of Wyoming and ask our guests, what's your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
I'm going to have to go with two because it's hard to narrow down to just one. But I love any time, particularly in the summer, when I can be over in the encampment or the Saratoga area. That's the gem. I probably shouldn't say that out loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't go there. No.
Don't go there. And then the other one is just the University of Wyoming's research station, the AMK, on the shores of Jackson Lake. That's a particularly spectacular spot to be, and have had the honor to teach a couple classes out there and expose our students to Wyoming's beauty.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all you do for the state, for the university, for working with us here at the School of Energy Resources, and thanks for doing the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.